The views expressed in this interview are those of the individuals and do not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Navy, or the Naval Postgraduate School. Welcome to the Trident Room, brewer of stout conversation, unfiltered and on tap. On today's episode, Trident Room host Luke Gorski sits down and has a conversation with Professor James Wirtz.
Hello and welcome to the Trident Room podcast. My name is Luke Gorski and today I'm joined by Professor Wirtz. He is a National Security Affairs professor here at the Naval Postgraduate School and the author of a July Proceedings article entitled Unmanned Ships and the Future of Deterrence. Professor Wirtz, how are you today?
Good. Great to be here. Thanks.
So before we kick off and discuss your article, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, how you got here to MPS?
Well, I studied political science and psychology at the University of Delaware, got a master's degree there, and then I went off to Columbia for my doctoral work. I spent a few years at Harvard as an Olin Fellow, worked with Sam Huntington at the Center for International Affairs, and then I had a series of a few one-year jobs before I came out to California for the first time, interviewed here, and thought it was a nice place to be. So I've been here for a few decades now, but it's a great place. and really enjoy MPS, enjoy the students. It provides a lot of opportunities, not just for the students, but for the faculty.
Yeah, I've loved my time here at MPS so far, and you cannot beat Monterey, California as a duty station. So let's dive right into your article now. I think that one of the key points that I think we should discuss first is one of the some of the ideas you brought up in your article, which included the idea of sea control versus sea deterrence. Could you just kind of expand on that for the audience?
Sure. Well, the idea of sea control and sea denial and really command of the sea is really sort of the central concept. That's an old idea, something that was in Mahan's writings and Corbett's writings. And the idea of sea control is that if you have command of the sea, what you can do is you could exploit the oceans for your own purposes. You could use it to transport resources. You could use it to project power ashore, and you could deny your opponent the ability to use those waterways for their purposes. So, if you're a maritime power and you can control the seas, you could harness resources on a global scale, compared to what generally is thought of as a continental opponent who could only draw on resources on a continental scale. So the idea of command of the sea is that you actually use the world's waterways for your purposes, and you could deny that to your opponent. So right off the bat, you could say, well, are the oceans a highway or a barrier? And I always had to laugh. John Mersheimer, who's at University of Chicago, describes the world's oceans as a barrier, but the guy's, he's obviously a landlubber, right? From Chicago. No, it's really a waterway, it's a highway. Mahan saw it as a highway. But it's that command of the sea that turns it from a highway. If you've got command, you could use it as a highway, or it's a barrier. If you have command of the sea, you could deny the opponent access to the ocean. So when you think about command of the sea, it's really not an offensive or defensive situation. It's really a situation where you can control and utilize, and you could deny the opponent the ability to do that. Robert Rubel, he was a dean at the Naval War College, about 10 years ago, wrote an article about the notion of command of the sea and sea denial. And this was 10 years ago. He said people had really forgot about this, that people hadn't used this idea. And the reason why is that really since the end of the Second World War, the U.S. has enjoyed a position of command of the sea for the most part. I mean, not to say that the Russians, weren't, the Soviet Navy was a real problem. Not to say that, the casualties at sea have been taken over the years. It's just that for the most part, we really were able to exploit the oceans, the world's oceans, for our own political and military purposes, and we could deny that same benefit to the opponent. So we kind of took command of the sea for granted. But now, with the rise of anti-access and aerial denial capabilities, you can't take that for granted anymore.
That's right, and I think that's definitely something that we're starting to see become more and more important. Yeah, and I think that your article really dives into the way that the Navy can or should address some of those issues. And as the title of your article contends, unmanned ships and the future of deterrence, unmanned systems are going to play a large role in that going forward.
Yes, well, what the problem here is that this was actually an issue that Wayne Hughes identified many years ago. Was actually in the middle of the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s when he wrote his Fleet Tactics book. He looked out at the world, looked at the naval situation, and said what the U.S. Navy was kind of lacking in was sort of a sea denial capability, that we needed to bring more offensive firepower, ability to hold the opponent's fleet at risk. We needed more of that capability. And the way he saw doing that was with small ships armed with missiles, right? Now, he wrote this just at the time when the Cold War was coming to an end, so we don't have to deny the ocean to anybody because there's nobody else out there, right? We're really the only Navy out there. And the irony behind Hughes's life and life's work was that he knew, as he was writing this stuff down, that it was becoming irrelevant in a way to the Navy's current position. And he died a few years ago just as what he was writing became relevant again. So, the lesson there is that if you stay in the business long enough, you see it all twice, and there's a cycle that repeats. But that cycle is repeating because now you're facing opponents who are now going to deny the United States command of the sea. We're now facing a situation where opponents are trying to deny us access to the world's oceans. So how are we going to fight our way back in there? And the idea here is that we're going to develop our own sea denial capabilities to engage their sea denial capabilities to try to wrest back command of the sea, or at least deny them the use of those parts of the ocean that we want to prevent them from using.
Right. So I think one of the big things that you discussed in your article, the term that you brought up was the idea of a bimodal Navy. Can you just dive into that a little bit for us?
Yes, that was one of Hughes's ideas too. I think I link it to an article he wrote in 2007. But the idea here is that you have two kind of fleet structures out there. One is the Sea Control Navy, and that's pretty much the Navy we have now, based around a carrier battle group. That Navy, that force structure is sort of an all-purpose force structure. We could do air, sea, subsurface sorts of operations, and when that fleet structure is out there, you could you could control the world's oceans, you could exploit that command of the sea using that force, right? You could project power. You could sink enemy combatants. You can conduct amphibious operations. That force provides you that capability. The problem is that you have to be careful putting that force too much into harm's way. So what we're looking at now is a force that maybe can go more into harm's way and deny the opponent's, to go after directly the opponent's fleet.
Yeah, I think that it's going to be a lot better, or at least in the U.S. Navy's calculations, it's going to be a lot better to send some unmanned systems into those anti-access area denial envelopes rather than an aircraft carrier or some other type of manned ship.
Yes, and the unmanned ship provides you a lot of flexibility, right? So you could, for starters, use it to conduct operations that are really risky. How long has it been since the U.S. Navy really put ships at deliberate risk? And it's been a while. I mean, I think the classic example of this, and my colleague Jeff Klein, professor in the OR department, we laugh about this all the time. During the Normandy landings, there was a destroyer captain, and the destroyers, they had a group of destroyers that came in very close to the Normandy landings that were supposed to engage literally individual machine gun nests, right? So this was an old World War I destroyer they had. They didn't risk. I think they didn't risk the best thing they had on it. But the gun crew was having a hard time hitting the gun position. So the captain said, "Don't worry, I'll help you out." And he grounded it. He drove it up on the beach and said, "Is this helping?" And they took out Now think about that. That you had a CO who was willing to drive the ship aground to stabilize the platform to take the shot. You wouldn't see that today, right? We don't think about it that way. We don't operate that way. But if you had warships, if you had platforms that you could deliberately risk, it would open up a whole range of operations that you can't do right now. You could take real risks. What would that capability give you to a commander at sea to say, hey, we know we might lose this, but it's okay. We have more of them, right? Another thing about the unmanned vessels is that they should be, and we hope they'll be cheaper than a manned vessel. You've got to avoid gold plating the things, but if you can make them relatively inexpensive, you could build a lot of them. And with that, you begin to complicate the opponent's targeting problems. It's a lot more to target, a lot more to keep track of. You could also get a lot more ordnance in the field. One idea here is that we have to stop thinking about naval matters and capabilities based on ships, but more based on weapons. So if these unmanned vehicles, platforms, allow you to get more weapons in theater, that's great, because we need more weapons in theater.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. There's always a lot of talk about how many VLS cells we can bring to a fight. Being able to distribute those cells, or those missiles, I suppose I should say, away from some of the larger platforms and force the enemy to use more of their missiles, and then it gets into a missile stock equation, which always complicates the situation.
And even if you have, say, a round number of 100 VLS tubes on the thing, well, how many weapons do you really have? You've got defensive missiles on there. You got some offensive missiles, a couple different kinds, but we're really talking relatively small numbers. Can you be generous when it comes time to fire, or do you have to withhold fire to make sure you have the right target?
And then as soon as you fire, you become a pretty obvious bright spot on the enemy's sensors.
Well, that's another issue that comes up, is that we, over the years, for purposes of peacetime economy, and to make that sort of sea control Navy that's all purpose, we put a lot of different capabilities on single ships where in reality you might want to disperse those things across different kinds of platforms. So if you lose one platform, you might lose one capability but not all capability. Like an undersea capability, air-to-air capability, anti-ship capability, sensors. Well, that's what I'm describing is sort of an Arleigh Burke destroyer. Not if you disperse that, if you lose part of that, you don't lose all of it at once.
Right, I think that's going to be really important in terms of ensuring survivability in any type of hot war going forward.
And you think the sensor suites are the sensors are the first things that are going to be targeted because you can see them. And if you look at the history there, the history there, it's the air battles around Okinawa are illustrative because it was the picket destroyers on radar duty that took the brunt of the kamikaze attacks because they were out there radiating, could be spotted. They were the forward deployed ones. So that's what took a lot of hits. And if you could, that way you could denude the air defenses, and you're more likely to penetrate the cap to get in at the carriers. So that's a lesson that that I'm sure the Navy's thinking about, is that, we have to think about the sensors here, so not that they draw fire, but that we could get them away from the center of gravity in the fleet.
Right, yeah, in this case, basically decoupling some of the pieces of the weapon systems.
Yeah, that would be a good way to think about the use of unmanned vehicles, to decouple. And the first thing you'd probably want to do is decouple the sensors, to get some sensors farther away from the main platform. I think when we think about unmanned vehicles, there's a lot of concern about the legal aspects, the moral aspects of having autonomous systems out there. But you don't necessarily have to make them lethal to begin with. The sensor function you could use, do that right away, and who's really going to complain about that?
Right, it's a great first step, and really it's going to enable us to start to figure out how we're going to employ these systems, what the infrastructure is behind it, and those type of things.
Well, that's the other real issue here when you talk about unmanned systems this way. What is, and I've been asking this question a long time, what is the doctrine going to be? How are we going to fight with these things, right? Do the drones protect the humans, or the humans protect the drones? How does this all work together? Is it going to be centrally controlled? Are they going to be, how autonomous are they going to be? Will they be autonomous in their movement, but not in terms of their main operating systems, or will be completely autonomous? I think the Navy's beginning to work on these things, but there's an awful lot of work that has to be done to think about how's the best way to integrate this. Sometimes I hear rumors or echoes or hints that, oh yeah, we worked on that, we did some analysis here, we did some analysis there. So it's sort of going on, but I don't know if it's how centralized it really is.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. I think there's a lot of people that say, yeah, we're working on that problem, we understand that problem, but then it doesn't get further discussed.
Well, and the other thing is when you think about a drone, it's being portrayed like the Sea Hunter, for example, had like a 96-day endurance, right? When you think, boy, that's pretty good. It is pretty good, 96 days. But that doesn't mean it can't be out there all the time. It's going to be out there some of the time. So where is it going to be when it's not at sea? Is it going to be on a mothership? Is it going to be in an Allied port? Because do you really want to sail the thing from San Diego or Honolulu or Guam? Where are you really coming from with this thing? So do you want it in an Allied port, sort of forward deployed? Do you want it on a mothership? Who's going to do the maintenance on it? What's the maintenance cycle? What are the maintenance ratios? If it's good for 96 days at sea, does that mean you need 2 of them to maintain continuous presence, or 3 or 4 or 5? I mean, that kind of analysis, all that needs to be done.
Yeah, and I think that talking about forward deployment, yes, and I think about, try one more time. Yes, and talking about forward deployment, and whether that's forward basing or motherships, and likely in the case of any kind of hot war, I would guess motherships. One of the big considerations is that 50 knots across the Pacific Ocean pretty much takes you out of the fight, coming from San Diego or even Honolulu in some cases.
You know what? There's a lot of times where you begin to look at the distances involved in the Indo-Pacific, and boy, how are you going to have the right force in the right place at the right time I think it's a real issue. That means, talk about the intelligence perspective on this, is that you really need some realistic warning, strategic warning over what's unfolding, so you can, even if it's autonomous vehicles, even to get them in position is not going to be easy to do. So, I think all these issues have to be thought through, and we're not really thinking them through in a systematic way. Small things like education, where are the officers going to come who are going to operate these things and understand them, understand the strategy behind it? We don't have them either. They're not here yet. So, and there's nothing in the Navy personnel system to produce people like this, because there are no billets that are P-coded for that subspecialty, because it doesn't exist. Right? There's no drone operator or drone commander or a drone commodore.
Right, so it's great to go and start building them, but once they get to the fleet, it's figuring out how to use them. And talking about some of the organizational culture in the Navy now, you get something brand new and shiny, and there's maybe a little bit of fear, and I better not break this shiny new toy I've been given.
Right. Well, that could happen, but you're right about that. Just, there's this romantic image that we'll just give it to a group of young people in the field, but no, we need analysis. Who really should use it? How should it be used? What are we trying to do with it? All of this has to be thought through. People can experiment with it, right? The details on how you really tactically operate this thing, it's going to be done by the operators. The fine tuning is done by operators, but generally speaking, what are we going to do with it? What are we going to direct it at? That's got to be done as a process of integrating strategy with operations, with tactics, with a lot of analysis to think about, what are we going to use these things for? Small things like, when can we use it? When would you actually deploy this? Do you have it out there all the time? Do you have it out there some of the time? Do you do it only as a matter of strategic force generation when you have warning? What does that signal to the opponent? Will the politicians be reluctant to activate the systems because it sends the wrong signal? All this stuff has to be thought through in advance, and very, very little of it has been.
Right, and kind of to drill down on the deterrence piece there, one of the things you talked about in your article is that having these unmanned systems to enable a distributed, survivable offensive force, you can kind of create some sense of deterrence and potentially avoid conflict.
The nightmare scenario is that if your forward presence is so small, right, and takes so long to generate additional force structure, outward is going to do some good. If you're just out there with a couple of destroyers or a single surface action group, or one ARG is out there, one ESG is sort of out there, it's just not a lot of capability, and that becomes sort of a tempting target, right? Minimal capability is it's not a lot to eliminate that target, and then say, well, now we're free to do what we want for a while. We're already saying it's going to be at least a couple of weeks, right, before anything more significant is going to get out there. So do you want leaving any kind of force structure in a vulnerable position just sort of turns it into a tempting target, but a small force structure in a vulnerable position really makes it, it turns it more into a target than a deterrent, because it's just, Can it defend itself? Can it really make a difference? Will it be in the right position? Having more force structure out there actually should bolster deterrence because it's not something that's easily taken out in one shot. That's what you really want to avoid. That just too few aim points, and then it might tempt the opponent.
So to maybe mirror some of the conversations we've been having in the international relations class that you're teaching that I'm in this quarter, does having this survivable system that doesn't necessarily involve the cost of human life, does that maybe increase the likelihood of conflict breaking out when politicians or policymakers or whatever other decision makers are involved in that chain there? When they're making those calculations, are they more likely to be willing to engage in conflict as a result of not having to risk as many, maybe none or as many humans? Let's try that one more time. So getting into maybe some of the conversations that we've been having in the international relations class that you're teaching this quarter, as we look at how policymakers and people making decisions all up and down the chain of command and using these unmanned systems, does perhaps having an unmanned system in some ways potentially increase the chance of war breaking out as a result of us not having to necessarily risk the human capital that is usually associated with those types of missions?
People have made that argument, and I think it's a valid one. It could be that way. During the Trump administration, the Iranians shut down a couple of drones, and the Trump administration didn't really respond that much. But they really didn't respond. They said, well, yeah, it's a drone, right? I mean, they didn't say, we're not going to go to war over a drone. That's probably true. But will that serve the cause of peace or make people more, in the sense that we'll deter war with that, or will make them more risk acceptant and will provoke a war? I don't know the answer to that. Will wars between drones break out and then humans might not be involved? It's a good question too. But that's still pretty far in the future, that sort of scenario. And what you find is that even though the war might start out with drones, it's probably going to involve humans pretty quick.
Right, and especially when we're looking at the advanced and offensive capabilities that have been coming out. And, if the enemy's just out there destroying your drones and you don't really care about it, well, they'll pretty quickly go and try and find the things that you do care about and target those.
Or even just because you think you're shooting at a drone, well, that wasn't a drone, it was a ship with people on it. Or you can't, the drone's shooting you, you're shooting at drones, and then all of a sudden the ship, enters the scene. Were you just going to let them sit there, or you to take the first shot? The analogy that comes to my mind is the Vincennes shoot down, where the Vincennes was in a surface engagement with Iranian gunboats and regrettably accidentally shot down an Iranian airliner. But if you think about it, here you're in a surface action, and the next thing you know, you think there's an air threat coming. Well, if you would have had the surface action against drones, and the next thing you see is an air threat coming, well, then you could see how these things happen. That just because you want to privilege not shooting at human beings, you don't want to shoot at human beings, in a wartime scenario, it's going to be really hard to make a snap decision on what's actually manned and unmanned. So, yeah, I think if it starts with drones, it won't stay with drones. Yeah. Especially if we're operating together with the drones.
Right, and relatively close naval battles have a different sense of distance scale than land battles do. So there's some differences that come into that in itself.
You would think. But, and the other thing, too, is that's a good thing about thinking about how these drones will operate. A lot of times people think they'll be completely independent out there, which isn't true. If you go out, if you really think about more of a flotilla than an independent actor, so if you're out there on a destroyer and you're in charge of the flotilla, the drones might be over the horizon, but it's still going to be operating with you. I mean, the thing's going to be following whatever algorithm it's following, whatever control network is. It's going to be either trail me or follow me or mimic me or go in front of me or stay behind, and I'll defend, as maybe an offensive platform, I'll defend that. But the idea here is that we're going to operate in concert together, so you don't necessarily have to put the drones on full auto. I mean, they can work in conjunction with you with some degree of control.
Right, and I think that AI piece is going to be extremely important because as we start looking forward into future high-end war, it's going to be largely the electromagnetic spectrum is going to play a very key role in that, and it's going to be contested. So we cannot always rely on constant communications. We're either going to be unable to communicate, or communications will be intermittent. So having the ability for the drones to go out and make their own decisions without input, while that might be, something that really gives a lot of people goosebumps, I think it's going to be a necessary piece of the integration of unmanned systems.
You've got to go local at some point. In fact, I guess there was the newspaper report about the war game.
Yeah, I think it was lost all network connectivity on day one. And it threw us for a loop, through my understanding.
Yeah, well, there's more right now. When you see a lot of naval writing about this, is that you've got to have sort of a localized precision strike complex. So, the strike group, the battle group, whatever the even individual actor's got to be able to link into its own sort of, strike complex, so it can target, identify target, and fire using organic assets. Because if you lose big connectivity to the big picture, you're kind of on your own. I guess some of the thinking is that little strike group made up of the drones now gives you a independent, precision-guided strike complex that's very organic. You give those assets back. Which points to maybe we really just, a good place to start, once again, is with the ISR on the drones.
Yeah, and I can see a lot of the surface warfare officers really, I think, being happy about the potential for, if you're a DDG captain and you have a couple of drones under your command, does that make you a Commodore? Because that sounds pretty good to most people, I think.
Somebody once said to me, "No, there's no captain who doesn't want to be a Commodore." Right.
There you go.
Well, I think, and why aren't they jumping on? But see, these are some of the questions we have. Why isn't the Navy jumping on it? Why isn't the SWO community jumping on this? Because it really turns every CO now into commander of a flotilla. In the old days, when there used to be a lot of Navy ships, the captain was the Commodore, right, of the flotilla. That when you actually had a Desron, it actually had 20 destroyers in it, or 30 destroyers in it. It wasn't, today you look at Desron, there's like a cruiser someplace, and there's a destroyer over the horizon, and there's the Desron. Where is it? Or am I imagining things?
No, I think you're exactly right. At least in my experience, I think that, even 5 would be a lot.
5 would be a lot.
Yeah, and the next piece, and something that we haven't really discussed too much, is the air wing side of this, and perhaps that's where the bureaucratic entrenchment that we talk about in our IR class kind of starts to play a role in this.
The sad thing is that the Navy had the XB-47, which was a really cool-looking drone, and they did the carrier tests of it about a decade ago. They had a couple of them, and it worked. From everything I've ever heard, it worked really, really well. Maybe that was the problem, right? The thing was actually wearing holes in the flight deck because every time it landed, it hit the exact same spot. It's pretty good. But, you would think, why doesn't every pilot, aviator in the Navy have a wingman that's the drone? Why don't we could have that already. Why don't we have that already? Why aren't we already flying with that sort of thing? And, the drone could be equipped to do those risky things that you don't really want to do. Or it could be the ISR platform. Or it could be the extra missile carrier, the shooter that's, standing off and taking shots or going forward and taking the shot. So, I don't know why that hasn't been more exploited more quickly.
Yeah, and one of the things, I'm a Navy guy, so I don't want to talk too much for the Air Force, but with the idea of the expansion of the drone fleet in the Air Force, they largely operated independently of the jets. So perhaps if we were able to couch this the same way to the pilots as we would to a surface warfare officer, where, hey, it's not that the drone is operating out independently, it's that you are a squadron commander in charge of a section of drones.
Yeah, maybe that, the war on terror with the use of drones, that's really sort of a an odd set of circumstances, because what you had is a very permissive environment, right? So that what really enables the drones, the way they're used in sort of a counter-terror weapon, as for targeted attacks, is that it's based. The thing is it's not independent. It's flown remotely via a network, and that network works in a permissive environment where the opponent doesn't have real good jamming technology, right? So if you're in a denied area, you can't really fly that drone because it's going to be really, really hard to maintain the communications. The other thing is that the drone isn't carrying a lot of ordnance on it. So it's got an ordnance package that's right sized for the war on terror, where I need to take out an SUV or a room in an apartment complex. But against a warship or an armored vehicle, it just doesn't have a lot of firepower, right? So the drone technology, the way it was employed in the war against terror, was sort of a perfect storm of right technology, right kind of weaponry, right kind of threat environment that it could operate in. That's probably not the environment we'll see going forward. So that model is useful to a certain extent in a permissive environment against a certain kind of target, but not against the targets we're kind of talking about, where the environment won't be permissive, right? And the targets are going to be different. It's not going to be killing somebody in SUV. It's going to be trying to hit a warship, or maybe even a fixed position that's fortified, somewhere hard in some way.
Right, so in that case, the baby step we took towards drones there is not necessarily the correct baby step to take as we look to use drones in great power competition. Right,
and for what the Navy really needs. I mean, the Navy has that kind of technology now, but to really have something that's a capable weapons carrier, or a capable surveillance system, or even a capable decoy to fly along as a wingman or something like that, as a defensive system for a wingman, as your wingman, that's not a bad idea. And you would think, as one aviator once said, at least I'll know where the wingman is, right? I mean, whoever it is will be doing what you tell it to do, and it's the right job. But I don't know why. These are good questions. Why this would really be a lot of capability. It would enhance the effectiveness of the human operator and the human system. And why it's not being included is a question that we often wonder.
Well, right. Well, hopefully conversations like this, articles like yours, they've been written for a while, but I think that it's really starting to come to the forefront here as we start to look at great power competition. The use and integration of drones it's here, it's real, and if it comes to a hot war, it's going to be necessary.
And, we need capability. We need capability now. We can't wait 20 years for another for a new warship design, new kind of system. I mean, we need stuff now. We don't have 20 years to wait for this. We need it now. These systems are kind of available. I worry about it getting too gold-plated. That I think the first Sea Hunter cost $20 million. The second Sea Hunter cost $40 million. That did not make me happy. No, it's not the right way going. No. You're right. So when these things, if it gets too much, if 110-foot drone warship is now up to $100 million, that's probably real bad. We're not heading in the right direction. So you want to keep prices down because we want to build a lot of them.
Right, and we want to build a lot of them quickly. So maybe with a smaller, less expensive system, you're able to unlock a larger proportion of the shipbuilding or just general defense industrial base within the United States.
That's another good point. And and if you don't have too much sunk costs into the individual unit, you could discard it, you could modify it. You probably want to make these modular to a certain extent so that you could swap out weapon systems when the time comes. We don't really have anything that's purpose-built for an unmanned drone in a surface-to-surface engagement, but that doesn't mean you won't have that in 5 years or 10 years if you put your mind to it and say, what kind of system do we really need? But, with all of this, we need some more strategic thinking. What is it we're going to be trying to do out there? Who are we going to be doing it against? Over what issue? In what body of water, right? And then you're going to want to say, what are the opponent's weaknesses we're going to really target? I mean, if you use this targeting the opponent's strengths, it might not help you out. What other weaknesses? Are there weaknesses we could use this against? You've got to do some analysis to say, what are we going to use this for? And then that might tell you how much do you need or how should it be deployed. one thing that comes out of Hughes's work is the sides that do well in naval warfare are the ones who think the problem through in advance.
Yeah.
Right? If you get out there and, if you're the CO and you turn to the XO and say, what are we going to do? That's real bad, right? Mm-hmm. That's really, really bad. You want to know, the plan's got to be in place. It's got to be tested. You got to trust it. You got to really think it through. It's the side that thinks it through in advance is the side who usually prevails. You got to do it in advance. And that's why students are here at MPS, so we can start thinking these things through in advance and preparing you to keep working on that in the future.
Yeah, and I think that in my 2 quarters or so at MPS here, that's definitely been the case. So, the ability to have conversations with interesting people like you, or just have time to think about some of these future problems. When you're out on a ship or out at some different command, you're not necessarily thinking about how you're going to employ these drones. You're thinking about maintenance or that type of thing.
It's the Navy is a floating maintenance nightmare, right? No, it's all very it's all very operational. It's all very here and now. It's hard to think about the big picture when you're out there, stand and watch, and being a SWO is grueling enough.
Yeah, not a life for me. That's why I chose the Intel side.
Well, there you go. No. Yeah, you don't want. No, that's really tough way to live. So, yeah, no, you need some time to sit and think about it in advance. You've got to think it through. It always bothers me. Well, in the interwar period, Trent Hone was the guy who wrote the book about learning in the Navy in the interwar period. It was published by U.S. Naval Institute Press, and Navy doctrine for. He was talking about Navy doctrine for cruiser destroyer independent operations. They said, although trust the innovation and leadership and bravery of the officers involved, I'm like, oh boy, that doesn't sound like a plan, right? That is not a plan. You don't want that. You really want to think it through, because it's really, sometimes it's not a matter of, no matter how brave you are or smart you are or how quick you can think on your feet, if you're not set up for success, it's not going to work.
Right, the Navy has to be willing to sacrifice times for people like me or really every officer to come out and think about these things.
It does take time. It takes time.
Right, to do the reading, or, the Navy already has a global mission and there's gaps in presence in places. So, but the Navy has to be willing to go and say, okay, well, this carrier strike group, instead of going on your traditional deployment, you're going to be going out and learning how to use these new systems.
You would think I know there is a group dedicated for drone experimentation. It's based around the Zumwalt, and they've got the 2 Sea Hunters, but that's it.
Yeah.
So, that's something, but you would think, why don't we have a little more? I'm surprised they don't have more drones. I'm surprised they didn't build more Sea Hunters, even for experimentation, right? Why not a dozen? That would have been a nice round number and to work with. Luckily, they have 2, but a dozen, so you go out and actually operate with them and see work the kinks out. But you'd also think that the people should think through the problem and suggest ways to operate these things, not so it's some random walk by the guys who are operating it for a few weeks a year, a few months a year.
Right. Yeah, it's got to be continuous and reevaluated, and with, like you said, a lot
right.
of planning
and integrated. Right. Don't plan on using a thing for more than 90 days. Don't plan for using it more than 30 days. What's the maintenance cycle? Where how much range is it going to have when it sails out to meet you? If it sails out from far away, all kinds of issues like that.
Well, thank you so much for coming in and sitting down and having this conversation. It was an illuminating conversation, at least for me.
Hey, it's great to be here. Great to talk about these things. And if anybody hasn't read the article, it's Proceedings.
That's right. It was in the July 2021 issue of Proceedings. The article was called "The Unmanned Ships and the Future of Deterrence" by Professor James Wirtz from here at the Navy Postgraduate School. And do you have anything else coming out, Professor?
Nope. Oh, not well. We have a piece. Jeff Klein, me, Auger. Klein's in the OR department. Auger is in the business school, in the defense management school, and a former student Phil Cornell, we have a piece coming out in the Russi Journal, the Royal Service Institute, on the Maritime Strategic Imperative, which basically talks about why the Navy needs to go down the drone route.
Well, there you go. Maybe a little bit of deeper dive into these things that we talked about today. Well, thank you very much, sir.
Thanks for joining us in the Trident Room. This episode was recorded July 30th, 2021. For more information about today's guests and topics, please visit the show notes. The Trident Room has been brought to you by the Naval Postgraduate School Alumni Association and Foundation. For questions, comments, and suggestions, please email us at tridentroompodcasthost@nps.edu and find us online at nps.edu/tridentroompodcast.